July 1260, the court of Kublai Khan. The grandson of Genghis Khan sat on a throne that commanded the largest empire the world had ever seen. From the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, Mongol horsemen ruled. But Kublai was about to make a decision that would change the course of history. A decision that seemed brilliant at first, but one that would ultimately destroy his dynasty. He issued paper money backed by silver, the world's first precious metal standard for paper currency. At that moment, no one could have predicted that this innovation would, within 108 years, reduce an entire empire to ruins and send millions of Chinese people back to trading chickens for rice. This is the story of the Yuan Dynasty, the story of how the world's most sophisticated currency system became worthless paper, and how a revolutionary financial idea turned into a weapon that killed an empire. When Kublai Khan conquered China in 1279, he inherited a problem that had plagued empires for millennia. How do you collect taxes from 60 million people spread across millions of square miles? How do you pay armies stationed thousands of miles from the capital? How do you facilitate trade across an empire so vast that a merchant could travel for a year and never leave its borders? The answer was already there, waiting. The Chinese had invented paper money 250 years earlier, but it was chaotic. Different regions used different currencies. Some provinces used copper coins, others used iron. Paper money existed, but it was backed by nothing, trusted by no one, and accepted grudgingly at best. Kublai saw an opportunity where others saw confusion. In July 1260, within months of claiming the throne, he introduced the Zhongtong Cheo, paper notes made from the bark of mulberry trees. Each note was stamped with the imperial seal. But this was different from anything that had come before. These notes were backed by silver. 2 guan of paper money could be exchanged for 1 tael of silver at government bureaus. For the first time in human history, a government pegged paper currency to a precious metal, the world's first silver standard. The impact was immediate and revolutionary. Suddenly, a farmer in southern China could sell his rice for paper notes and use those same notes to buy tea in Beijing. A merchant could transport a year's worth of wealth in a small bag rather than wagons of metal coins. Tax collectors no longer needed armed escorts to haul copper across the empire. The Yuan government set up silver exchange bureaus in major cities across China. People could walk in with their paper notes and walk out with silver at a guaranteed rate, minus a small 3% commission. If their notes were damaged, they could exchange them for new ones. The system worked because it was simple and because people believed the government had the silver to back it up. By the 1270s, paper money was everywhere. Peasants used it to buy rice and salt. Merchants used it to purchase silk and tea. Government officials received their salaries in paper notes. Soldiers were paid with it. Taxes were collected in it. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who arrived at Kublai's court in 1275, was astounded. He wrote that the great Khan's paper money, made from the bark of trees, was accepted throughout the entire empire. That the Khan could buy all the treasure in the world with money that cost him nothing to produce. Marco Polo called it the Golden Touch. At that time, most of the world used gold and silver coins. The idea that a piece of paper could have value seemed like magic to Europeans, like alchemy, turning bark into gold. But in China, it worked for a while. The early years of the yuan currency were stable. From 1260 to 1290, inflation averaged just 4.5% per year. Prices were predictable, the economy flourished, trade expanded. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, enabled goods and ideas to flow from Europe to China without interruption. It was an economic golden age. But the mathematics of empire were already working against Kublai Khan. Running the largest empire in history was expensive, staggeringly expensive. Kublai Khan maintained armies on multiple fronts. He built a new capital at Dadu, modern Beijing. He sponsored massive public works projects. He expanded the Grand Canal. He created 20,166 public schools. He funded the arts and sciences. And he was obsessed with expansion. Between 1274 and 1293, Kublai Khan launched invasion after invasion. Japan twice, Vietnam 3 times, Burma, Java, and Sakhalin Island. Each campaign required tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of ships, and mountains of supplies. The invasions of Japan were particularly catastrophic. In 1274, Kublai sent 900 ships and 40,000 men. A typhoon destroyed much of the fleet. In 1281, he tried again, this time with 4,400 ships and 140,000 men. The largest seaborne invasion in history up to that point. Another typhoon struck. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds. The Yuan called them bankruptcy. The campaigns in Vietnam were no better. 3 separate invasions between 1258 and 1287. Each one was initially successful, then bogged down in jungle warfare. The Vietnamese knew their terrain. They employed guerrilla tactics. They fought from the shadows. Yuan armies took cities, then lost them, advanced, then retreated. The campaigns drained the treasury without gaining territory. By the 1290s, the fiscal reality was undeniable. The silver reserves backing the currency were running out. Wars don't pay for themselves. Conquest requires gold, not promises. And the Yuan government had made promises it was about to break. The moment of truth came in 1276, just 16 years after introducing the silver standard. The Yuan government made a subtle but devastating change. Paper money was still officially backed by silver, officially exchangeable, but now with a qualifier. Notes could be exchanged for silver only when silver was available at the local exchange bureau. What did that mean in practice? If you lived in Western China, far from the capital, there might not be any silver at your local bureau. If there were a run on silver, the bureaus would run out. If the government decided not to replenish the reserves, you were out of luck. The silver standard had become a nominal silver standard, a standard in name only. People could still walk into exchange bureaus, but increasingly they walked out empty-handed. The promise was breaking down. But the system held, barely. Inflation from 1290 to 1340 averaged just 1.8% per year, lower than it had been under the full silver standard. People still trusted the currency. Why? Because the government wasn't printing vast amounts of new money, because trade continued to flourish, and because the economy was strong enough to absorb the change. Then came 1310. The year everything changed, the year the silver standard died completely. In 1310, Emperor Kublai Khan faced a crisis. The imperial treasury was depleted. Wars, public works, and imperial grants had drained the reserves. The government needed money desperately. So Kublai made a decision that would echo through the decades. He issued a new currency, the Jida Chao. This paper money was not backed by silver, not even nominally. It was fiat money. Money backed by nothing but the government's promise that it had value. The first true fiat currency in Yuan China. The public reaction was immediate and hostile. People rejected the new notes. They hoarded the old currency. They demanded silver. Inflation surged to 80% in a single year. Kublai Khan had no choice. In 1311, he withdrew the Jida Chao from circulation and returned to the old Yuan Chao notes. But the damage was done. The illusion of silver backing had been shattered. From 1310 onward, the yuan currency was officially fiat money. The government could print as much as it wanted. and for 40 years it showed remarkable restraint. From 1310 to 1350, the money supply grew, but slowly. Inflation remained moderate. The economy continued to function. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Natural disasters struck with increasing frequency. The Yellow River flooded in 1344, displacing millions. Famines followed. Epidemics ravaged the countryside. In 1331, a plague killed 13 million people. By 1333, entire provinces were depopulated. The Black Death was sweeping through China. The government's response was to spend more on relief efforts, grain distribution, and emergency public works. In 1351, they mobilized 150,000 farmers to rechannel the Yellow River and repair the Grand Canal. A massive project, a desperately needed project, and a project that required vast amounts of money the government didn't have. So they printed it. The printing presses ran day and night. The amount of paper money in circulation exploded. And then the rebellions began. In the summer of 1351, among the 150,000 workers conscripted to rebuild the Yellow River, dissent turned to revolt. A Buddhist monk named Han Shantong and his advisor Liu Futong recruited from the disgruntled laborers. They formed the Red Turban Army, named for their distinctive red headbands. The Red Turbans were more than rebels. They were a movement. They preached that the Buddha Maitreya was coming to end suffering. They claimed the Yuan had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. And they pointed to the evidence. The Yellow River flooding was traditionally seen as a sign that heaven had withdrawn its blessing from the emperor. The revolt spread like wildfire. Within months, multiple Red Turban factions controlled large swaths of southern China. The Yuan government responded with massive military force. Armies were raised. Campaigns were launched. Cities were besieged. The civil war that followed was the most expensive conflict in Yuan history, and the government paid for it by printing vast amounts of money. In 1352, the Yuan issued a new currency, the Zhizheng Chao. By 1355, the money supply had reached 170 million ding. This was astronomical. By comparison, the money supply in 1260 had been just 2.8 million ding. The effect on prices was catastrophic. Measured against gold, prices increased 267 times from the early Yuan period. Against silver, 15 times. Against basic commodities, anywhere from 250 to 800 times, depending on the region. Let's put that in human terms. A shi of rice, about 100 pounds, cost 0.2 guan in 1260. By 1355, it cost 50 guan or more. If you had saved 100 guan in paper notes in 1260, thinking you had enough to buy 500 shi of rice, by 1355 those same notes would buy you 2 shi. Your life savings could buy 2 bags of rice. The currency wasn't just losing value, it was disintegrating. By the late 1350s, merchants were refusing to accept paper money at any price. They wanted silver. They wanted gold. They wanted copper coins, even old ones from previous dynasties, anything but yuan paper notes. Contemporary scholar Wang Yun wrote that people blamed paper money as meaning nothing but empty script. The government tried to force people to accept the currency. They passed laws making it illegal to refuse payment in paper money. The penalty for refusal was death. It didn't matter. You can't force people to believe in money. Money is trust made tangible, and trust, once destroyed, cannot be commanded back into existence. By 1360, large parts of China had returned to a barter economy. Farmers traded rice for tools. Merchants traded silk for tea. Urban centers, which depended on currency for daily transactions, suffered the most. People fled the cities for the countryside where they could grow their own food. The government's authority was crumbling. Red turban warlords controlled the south. The Yuan armies were fragmented and unpaid. Soldiers deserted. Tax collection stopped. The administration fell apart. In the chaos, one red turban leader emerged, Zhu Yuanzhang, born a peasant so poor that he became a Buddhist monk just to eat. His family had been wiped out by famine and plague. He joined the Red Turbans in 1352 as a common soldier. Within 4 years, he had captured Nanjing. Within 15 years, he had defeated all rival warlords. On January 23, 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed himself Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. By August of that year, his armies entered Beijing. The last Yuan emperor, Togon Temur, fled north into Mongolia. The Yuan dynasty was over. The Mongol rulers never returned to China. The collapse of the Yuan dynasty was not just a political event, it was a human catastrophe. An entire generation of Chinese people watched their savings become worthless. Families that had carefully saved for decades found themselves destitute overnight. A scholar who had saved 1,000 guan over a lifetime of work discovered his savings couldn't buy a month's worth of food. A merchant who had stored paper notes as his retirement fund found that his life's work was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The civil wars killed millions. The Red Turban rebellions, the battles between rival warlords, the Yuan government's campaigns to suppress the rebels. Cities were sacked, villages were burned, farmland was abandoned. The population of China fell dramatically during these years. Epidemics swept through the war-torn provinces. The Black Death, which had arrived in 1331, continued to ravage the population. In Hebei province, 9 out of 10 people died. Across China, some estimates suggest 2 out of 3 people died between 1330 and 1370. Whether from plague, famine, or war, the Yuan collapse was apocalyptic. When the Ming dynasty finally restored order in the 1370s, they found a country in ruins. The economy had regressed by centuries. The sophisticated trade networks that had spanned Asia were shattered. The Grand Canal was silted up. Cities were depopulated. The tax base had disappeared. And the Ming, having witnessed the catastrophic failure of paper money, wanted nothing to do with it. The first Ming emperor, Hongwu, attempted to restore copper coins as the primary medium of exchange. When insufficient copper forced him to issue paper money, the public rejected it immediately. Within 20 years, the new Ming currency was worth less than a quarter of its face value. After that, China abandoned paper money entirely. For the next 400 years, China would use a bimetallic system: copper coins for daily transactions and silver for large payments and long-distance trade. The brief, brilliant experiment with paper currency was over. The lesson learned was simple and brutal. Paper money requires trust, and trust, once destroyed, takes centuries to rebuild. The Yuan dynasty's story was not the first time a currency collapse destroyed an empire. The Roman Empire had walked the same path centuries earlier. Emperor Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius to fund his public works. His successors continued the debasement. By the 3rd century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver, down from 95% just a century before. The result was predictable. Inflation exploded. Commerce collapsed. Cities emptied as people fled to self-sufficient rural estates. The Roman Empire fragmented and fell. The Dark Ages followed. But the Yuan dynasty's collapse was worse in one crucial way. Rome debased existing coins gradually over centuries. The yuan destroyed a working paper currency in just 60 years, from the first Zhongtongqiao note in 1260 to the worthless Shishengqiao in the 1350s. 3 generations watched the same currency go from miracle to disaster. Why did it happen? 3 reasons. First, military spending. The Yuan Dynasty fought constant wars. The invasions of Japan, Vietnam, and Burma drained the treasury. The Red Turban rebellions finished it. Wars are expensive in gold and silver. They cannot be fought with promises printed on mulberry bark. Second, the abandonment of the silver standard. When the Yuan government stopped backing paper money with silver, it removed the only constraint on printing. Under the silver standard, they could only issue as many notes as they had silver to redeem. Under fiat money, they could print unlimited amounts, and they did. Third, the loss of trust. Once people stopped believing the government would honor its currency, the currency became worthless, not gradually, suddenly, like a dam breaking. One day, money works. The next day, it doesn't, and there's no going back. The lesson echoes through history. Every dynasty that overissued paper money suffered the same fate. The Jin dynasty before the Yuan collapsed the same way. The Ming dynasty, after them, watched their paper money fail within 20 years. The Qing dynasty avoided paper money entirely until 1853, and then only under extreme duress. Modern observers look at the Yuan dynasty and think, that could never happen now. We're too sophisticated. We understand economics. We have central banks and monetary policy. But do we? Today, governments around the world run deficits that would have astonished Kublai Khan. They fund those deficits by printing money. Not literally anymore, now they do it digitally. But the effect is the same. More money chasing the same goods. Prices are rising. Savings eroding. The United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971. Not gradually, suddenly. President Nixon announced on television that the dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. The world's reserve currency became pure fiat money overnight, just like the Yuan Jidaqiao in 1310. Since then, the dollar has lost 85% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1971 costs $7 today, not from economic growth, but from money printing. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has grown from $80 billion in 1971 to over $8 trillion today, a 100-fold increase in 50 years. Other countries have it worse. Argentina has suffered multiple currency crises in the past 50 years. Venezuela's currency collapsed so completely that people use it as craft paper. Zimbabwe printed $100 trillion notes before abandoning their currency entirely. The pattern is always the same. The government spends more than it collects in taxes. The government prints money to cover the deficit. Initially, the economy seems fine. Then inflation appears, slowly at first, then faster, then catastrophically. People lose faith. The currency collapses. And every time, the people suffer. Not the government officials who made the decisions, not the politicians who spent the money. The ordinary people who saved in the currency, the workers who get paid in it, and the retirees living on fixed incomes, they watch their life savings evaporate. Just like the Chinese merchants in 1355 who couldn't buy rice with their paper notes. The Yuan Dynasty collapsed in 1368, 657 years ago. But the mechanism that destroyed it is active today. In America, in Europe, and in China. Everywhere governments have the power to print money, they eventually print too much. History shows this with monotonous regularity. Why? Because the temptation is irresistible. Raising taxes is politically difficult. Cutting spending is politically suicidal. But printing money? That's easy. That's invisible. And that's a problem for the next government and the next generation. Until suddenly it isn't. Until the currency collapses and an entire society has to rebuild from ruins. The Yuan Dynasty started with a brilliant innovation. Paper money backed by silver. a system that facilitated trade, simplified taxation, and unified a vast empire. A system that worked beautifully for decades. And then, under the pressure of wars and rebellions, the government printed too much. The silver standard was abandoned. The currency became worthless. And the dynasty fell. The parallels to today are uncomfortable. The United States fights endless wars: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Each one costs trillions of dollars. The government runs trillion-dollar deficits. The Federal Reserve prints trillions to buy government debt. The money supply explodes. But inflation remains relatively low for now, just as it did in Yuan China from 1310 to 1350. For 40 years, the yuan ran a fiat currency without catastrophic inflation. Then, when the civil wars began, when the government needed massive amounts of money immediately, the printing presses ran non-stop, and the currency collapsed within a decade. Could that happen today? Could the dollar, the world's reserve currency, collapse like the yuan zhizheng chao? Most economists would say no. They point to the Federal Reserve's sophistication, to the depth of U.S. financial markets, and to the dollar's status as the global reserve currency. But that's what people said about the yuan currency in 1340, that it had worked for 80 years, that it was backed by the largest empire in the world, that it was too important to fail. By 1360, it was worthless. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The Yuan Dynasty fell because its government spent more than it could tax, printed more money than the economy could absorb, and lost the trust of its people. The currency collapsed. The dynasty followed. Today, governments around the world are making the same choices, spending beyond their means, printing money to cover deficits, and hoping that this time will be different. But the mathematics of money haven't changed since 1260. You can't create wealth by printing paper. You can't fund wars with promises. You can't maintain trust by breaking it. The Yuan Dynasty learned that lesson at a cost of millions of lives and the collapse of the most powerful empire in the world. The lesson is there for anyone willing to learn it. The question is, will we?